Are you ready? 3, 2,
let's go.
1, let's go.
A lot of different names there. So Tammy and I are here today to help share with you our journey in canning, show you some new recipes, talk about our upbringing a little bit, and so you can get an idea of how you can apply this to your life, and then leave lots of ample time for you guys to ask those questions that you always want to ask and you just don't have anybody to ask them to, or you can't find the answers on the old Google. So I'm going to let Tammy introduce herself a little bit here, and then we'll start canning.
I started out, I was asked to start a group on Facebook where people could feel safe asking their canning questions and not get shut out, booted out of the Facebook group, or totally banned, or called all sorts of unchristian names just for asking a question. You know, that's how I learned, is asking questions, and I wanted a safe place for people to be able to ask a question about canning, because that's how I feel everybody learns. And so I started that. I got tired of saying the same thing over and over again. So I started a YouTube channel thinking, oh, I'll just post this video in my Facebook group and people will go and watch the video and I don't have to say it over and over again. Not true. The Facebook group crowd is 150K over here, and I have 10+K in the YouTube group, and there's only about 12 people that love me enough to watch me on both platforms.
I love
you! But I have been canning for more years than I want to admit to, on a taped live recording. But I started canning with my parents and my grandmother and my aunts and uncles, and my grandmother learned from her grandmother, not her mother. And so I have about 5 generations of canning experience behind me that I really want to share, because I think right now is the most important time in the world for everybody to have this skill. No matter if you're the 5-year-old just starting to learn with your family or you're 95, it's really important right now in our world culture to have this skill, and I want to be able to have all of you today ask any question you want and feel safe asking a question.
Thank you, Tammy. And I'm Sarah. Oh yes, let's clap. She's Sarah, let's clap. I'm Sarah, yes, let's clap for Tammy. And so I have a very similar background. Tammy and I were kind of raised in the Midwest around the same time. I'm from a long generational line of canners. We've got some recipes in my family dating back to the 1800s, so I know for sure there was a lot going on a couple hundred years ago with my family in canning. I most recently remember canning with my grandmothers and my mother, but it definitely goes back a lot further than that. I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, about, 12, 13 hours north of here. If you're Canadian, hey, you're more southern than I am. Very cold up there. We have a very short grow season up there, about 130 days. Our last snow pile last year was June 7th. We'll let that sink in. June 7th, we still had snow. So our grow season's really short, and so canning is really important to us, and it's the way that we sustain ourselves through the winter when we can't grow anything or when growing really slows down. So that's why I'm very passionate about it.
Or when the snow is too deep for her to go to the grocery store.
Right, yes, we do that a lot as well. We don't go to the grocery store a lot in the winter, for sure. I have 5 children, a grandbaby. I know what you're going to say. Yes, I promise you, I am not lying about that. And I recently created this canning book for you guys. And so if you have that book with you today, we're going to start on page 99. I say bruschetta in a jar. I've been corrected 100 times that it's bruschetta. However, I'm a new bird and we don't say anything correctly. So, bruschetta in a jar, which is basically like a pickled tomato with a lot of different spices in it. And we're going to talk a little bit about water bath canning and when it's appropriate to use the water bath canner as I'm canning the recipe. There will be a couple sections where I'll say, okay, let's ask questions about this. If you have any questions about this, if not, we're going to move on to the next section. I realize it is very hot outside and the sun is beating down and all these things. Please take good care of yourselves. Sit there and drink water. Get up and use the restrooms as needed. Take breaks. Let's all stay healthy throughout the whole day so we can learn as much as possible while we're here. Okay? Anything else? Okay. Tammy's going to be up next with the dairy, and we're going to kind of switch back and forth. Also, I'm going to be drinking a lot in between. So. We're going to start with the bruschetta in a jar, which is a water bath canning recipe. Let me get a good feel for the room. Who in here does any canning at all? Okay, a lot of you already can. Who does water bath canning? And who does pressure canning? And who has never canned anything a day in their life and want to learn? Yes. Clap for the newbies. So our job here today is to make sure that you have a safe environment to learn in and ask your questions. We're going to answer those to the best of our ability. Please remember that throughout all of these classes, everything is a your kitchen, your rules. Do you understand what that means? If you do, raise your right hand and say, I understand. I understand. That means we're going to tell you what we do in our kitchens. We're going to tell you what works for our family. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you need to do your own research. You need to find trusted sources. You need to dig. You need to make sure that you're feeding your family the most healthy, nutritious, safest food that you possibly can. And you need to do that by gathering more education than just 2 people. Okay? Water bath canning. When is it appropriate to water bath can? Anybody know what types of foods we can use in a water bath canner? What types of foods? Fruits? I'm sorry? High acid foods. I heard tomatoes. Anybody else?
Anything with a pH lower than 4.6.
Yep. We're calling out pH numbers. How about pickles? Pickles is a big one, and anything pickled. All right, so it doesn't just include your pickles, like your cucumber pickles or your bread and butter pickles, Jerkins pickles. It also includes any of your vegetables that you're going to pickle. So we're looking at our high acid foods. And while I'm talking and explaining water bath canning, if you want to follow along with the recipe, I'm going to start filling these jars so we keep everything moving. All right, so water bath canning for high acid foods. That's your fruits, jams, jellies, tomatoes with or without tomato or lemon juice. We'll talk about that in a second. And pickling vegetables in a pickling brine or a high acid brine. Now, water bath canning works by boiling our food to 212 degrees and then holding that for a predetermined amount of time. So 2 things that you have to hit in water bath canning: time and temperature. Time and temperature. Did anybody have a teacher in school that said, all right, your grade is going to be calculated on 2 scales, your attendance and how well you do on the test? And you have to hit those 2 things. So if you're a 100% A student and you get A's on every single test, but you only come to class once a week, you can't pass, right? So, and that's kind of what canning is. You have to hit those 2 benchmarks. You have to get the good grade and you have to be there all the time. If one of those falls below, if the time falls below, if the temperature falls below, then we're gonna say that food, don't eat it. It's not safe, don't eat that, all right? If you go above, say you process something a little bit too long or a little bit too high, is it gonna be okay? Yes, you're gonna be okay with above and over. We just have to hit those benchmarks. I'm gonna go back and forth here. So what I have in here is pint jars, and I've got them heated up. So does anybody know why we heat our jars? Thermal shock. Has anybody ever heard of sterilization? Okay, so this is actually a misnomer that is used in the canning community a lot. A lot of our older generation canners, which I consider myself one, we sometimes say, oh, you need to sterilize all of that, but we're not actually sterilizing. What we're doing is we're sanitizing. There's no way to sterilize your jars, your lids, your rings. There's no way to do that in a home kitchen, because the minute they come out of the canner, what happens? They hit the air has microbes, and you no longer have anything that is sterilized. So we can't do that in our home kitchens. But what we want to do is heat them to prevent thermal shock. So hot jars, hot food, hot canner. Room temperature jars, room temperature food, room temperature canner. We want to make sure that all 3 of those things are matching all the time. Even if you think you're not thermal shocking your jars, over time, anybody ever have a jar bottom blow out? Lose all your food, the jar just cracks and breaks on the bottom and there it goes. Those are typically caused from thermal shock, or you might get a crack in the jar, or sometimes the lid won't seal because there's a crack around the rim. So this prevents that. It also helps to clean and sanitize. So what should you use to clean and sanitize your jars before warming them?
Dishwasher?
Dishwasher's good. Hand wash, hot soapy water, rinse, any of those are acceptable. So I've got some hot jars here, and I'm gonna start pulling those out, and we're gonna start adding the tomatoes and all of the spices.
last year. We did everything we could think of with them, and then finally we did that.
Yep. Cherry tomatoes are a very prolific crop, and they're wonderful because once they take off, with a recipe like this, you can stick these in a Ziploc bag in your freezer, and then when you're ready to can them up, you just pull them out, stick them in the jars, and start canning.
Do you have a trivet under there in the pot?
Yes. So a water bath canner works by completely submerging the jars in water. Very different than pressure canning. So to completely submerge the jars in water, we need 1 to 2 inches of water above the canning lids. 1 to 2 inches. So there's water in here. I've got some water in the jars heating those. And then she asks, is there a trivet in there? There is. And if you don't have a trivet, you can use a dish towel. That works just the same. The idea is that we are getting the jars up off the bottom of the canner so we get nice, equal heating and boiling underneath the underside of the jar. Now this recipe makes, who's following along in their book? Anybody? This makes approximately 5 to 6 pint jars, and I'm going to try to double that because I got a lot of tomatoes. So I'm going to go spices, tomatoes, and get all these jars filled up, and then we'll make our brine.
Have you ever had issues with using yellow cherry tomatoes?
No.
Okay.
I often use rainbow cherry tomatoes for this recipe.
Okay.
The ones that have like the purple and the yellow and all those in them. And they are actually a lot more fun to look at when they're all rainbow colored. I'm sorry? Yes. I'm going to use 4 cups of water times 2 because I'm doubling this recipe. So she asked if you could use it in half pints. You can always adjust a recipe larger or smaller than what you need. And the way that works is if you are moving up one size, you change the time, the processing time that it needs to be done. So how you do that is you use your canning books. And your canning books will have time and temperature charts in them that will tell you how to move up or down on a recipe if you're going to run pints or quarts. In my canning book, it's the very last sentence of I put it on every single recipe. So you don't have to flip back and forth to the charts. It's on every single recipe. So this recipe, if you're doing pints, it's 10 minutes. If you're doing quarts, it's 15 minutes. Now, if you're doing something smaller than a pint, it stays at the pint time. Yep, so if it's an in-between size, this is 2 cups of white vinegar. If it goes to an in-between size, like a pint and a half size, you would process it for quarts. It has to go up because that jar's at an in-between size and you can't process it for the smaller time in the smaller jar. It needs to go to the bigger jar in order for it to get properly heated all the way through. Yeah, you're welcome. That was white vinegar. What makes this what I call bruschetta is the balsamic vinegar. And so we're going to use 1 cup of this. And you see I'm using my pint jars. You can use actually measured cups if you want. I've been doing this quite a while, so I'm pretty good at alcohol. Okay, sometimes we eat this out of the jar, not gonna lie. I will sit with a fork and just gorge myself. But if you want to actually use it for something, you can take any type of toast that you like, add some cheese on it, mash this up with a fork a little bit. It comes out pretty soft. Mash it with a fork, lay it on the toast, drizzle with olive oil or balsamic glaze, stick that in the broiler for like 5 minutes, and we have bruschetta, like a warmed bruschetta. I also use this in pasta dishes. I add it to my pasta sauces and my pizzas. Trying to think, there's one other way I like to use this. Oh, on my relish trays. So like at the holidays, we put out a relish tray with all different types of relishes, and I use that one with just like crackers and cream cheese. And it goes really well. Every recipe that I try to make for my own home, in my own house, I try to look at it and go, how can I make that how many different ways, right? Because if I'm gonna put up 40 pounds of sloppy joes, not everybody wants to eat that on a bun every time I serve sloppy joes. So I want to look at what kind of casseroles can I make, what kind of pasta dishes can I make, what kind of loaded nachos can I make, or loaded tater tots, or, you know, I'm always trying to think, how can I can something and then transform it into something else so I can use my same menu and change it up. You guys know what food fatigue is? Food fatigue is what happens when you eat the same type of food every day. Anybody in college ever survive on ramen? Maybe, sort of. Maybe you moved out of mom's house and it was like, oh, I should have paid more attention. Hot dogs and macaroni and cheese again. Not that those things aren't lovely, but I'm just saying, you know, you can get a food fatigue from eating those same foods all of the time. Yeah. So I'm going to use 1 cup of sugar. Remember, I'm making a double recipe. In the book, it's a single. I'm going to use 1 cup of just white sugar. This helps to balance out the acidity. And also, because this is a pickled food, it hits its sweet spot right between like 4 and 6 weeks. 4 and 6 weeks. Now, you can eat this right out of the jar as soon as it's done. But at that 4 to 6 week mark, oh, so good, so much better. So we're going to get the brine going on the stove and just get it heated while we're adding our tomatoes to the jars.
What would this recipe taste like at Christmas?
Beautiful.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, I could have used the empty one. Thank you, though. I actually love that one. Well, I need 1 to water bath kit. Is that okay? Okay.
Are you okay with substituting Splenda for sugar in the short recipe?
Yep, let me answer that in just a second. Oh, gotta turn it on. Hang on. I was like, why is that not eating? Okay, so the question was, can I substitute Splenda? And the answer to that is yes for this recipe. And in my book, I do go over how to substitute for certain recipes and if it's available or not. Most of your jams and jellies, you can substitute sugars with no problem, especially, I don't know if you guys have seen, but like some of the Sure gels or some of the canning gels have actual low sugar and no sugar options. So that's really great. In pickling, it's the same way. It's the acid that is going to pickle the food that makes it safe. So the acid raises it and the sugar binds to the acid, binds to the food, but so does sugar substitutes. So you can substitute honey, you could do Splenda. Anytime, or Swerve, I know a lot of canners that can with Swerve, they like that one. But anytime you are substituting anything in a recipe, my advice to you is to do it in a small batch. So you don't want to take an entire bushel of tomatoes and make a recipe that you've never tried before and put it on your shelves. What you really want to do is you want to do 4 or 5 jars. I usually do 3 jars or 4 jars. And what I do with that, I forgot all the other things. I'm going to put some garlic and spices in here first. What I mean by that is I will do it 4 jars and then I will label them after I process them. And I'll put a 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, and sometimes like a 2 month or 3 month label on them. And then I will open that jar at 1 week, 1 day, 1 month, on and on. Because the food can taste differently, especially with pickling. Remember I said it's kind of a sweet spot between 4 and 6 weeks. So it will get sweeter over time. So I had a jar yesterday that I opened and took a bite of, and I was like, ooh, like the bite on it was really, it was very vinegary. But once you let that sit for a while, then it starts to mellow out and sweeten. So do that small batch canning. Try them at different intervals. And then your canning book, whatever canning book you use, mine, somebody else's, wherever you're getting your recipes from, that book should be a living document. I'm just adding garlic cloves to each of the jars, as many as you want. I got 2 to 3 on the recipe. But you want to really, really use that as a living document. It should be like any document where you're making notes, you're saying, yes, my family loved this. Tammy's going to tell you a story here about her father real quick. But it should be a living document. That way you can remember from year to year exactly what you liked about it, didn't like about it, who ate it, who didn't. I need to make 20 more jars. We ran out early. Those kinds of things. Take it away, Tammy. Tell us your story.
So, one of my most prized possessions is my 1970 ball blue book. If you're a new canner, I advise you to get one that's 1980 or newer. You can buy a used one. They just change the cover. They don't change anything on the inside. very rarely. So anything 80 or newer will have the better times, the newer times, the updated times. But my 1970 Cook Ball Blue Book is my most prized possession. It belonged to my aunt. My mother borrowed it because she couldn't find hers, and it went back and forth between their two houses for many years before I finally inherited it after they both passed away. So in there are these notes. And on June 10th, 1972, they made a tomato chutney, and only my dad Herb liked it. Don't make it again. And that's what they wrote in there. Don't make this again. Poor dad, he got 18 jars and that was it. There was no more, and nobody was making it because he was the only one that could eat it. Of course, he lived through the Depression. He'd eat just about anything you put in front of him, but he actually really liked that tomato chutney, but we never made it again. And so there's just little notes like that, they changed the salt, like be a cross off of the 6 tablespoons of salt, and it'll say 2, or it'll say 3, or just little things in there that made it their own, that made it how it adjusted to our family's taste buds. And you're gonna find that too, but the thing is, one year I wanted to see what was the best pickle recipe, and I made 9 different batches of pickles, but I didn't keep all those recipes in order with the names and the way I did it. And I found the best pickle recipe. Can't replicate it because I didn't write the recipe. I didn't keep them all together. I grabbed them off this website and that website and over here and over there. And then when I went back to find it, I couldn't find the recipe again. So just keep a canning journal. It'll be worth its weight in gold. It'll keep you from making a lot of mistakes. It'll help you adjust the recipe from year to year on how you like it.
Yeah, I love that story. And we definitely have canning books at my house as well that has, all these thumbprints in them and watermarks. And what I do is I keep a canning journal, and I suggest you do too. Keep a canning journal, even if you're not writing in your books, and just write down, I did this year, this year, this recipe went great, and this one just was a bombshell. You are gonna find what your family likes. I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, man, I really wanted to like canned ground beef, but I just can't. It smells funny to me, or I don't like the texture of it. And what do I do with this 200 pounds of ground beef that I put up? And I'm like, woo, 200 pounds, first go, huh? So you want to make sure that you're small batch canning and you're keeping notes for yourself.
And don't be afraid to do some substitutions. You can substitute lime and lemon juice. So one of my favorite recipes is blueberry lime jam. The original recipe was blueberry lemon jam, but our family really likes the flavor combination of blueberries and lime better. So don't be afraid to make some of those lateral changes. Don't go off the grid up and down different ways, but you can make some of those lateral changes. Change the lemon juice acid for lime juice, or like in salsas, some people like lemon juice better, some people like vinegar better. So there are some ways you can laterally change recipes to make them your own without going outside of the guidelines, like me, who does go outside of the guidelines sometimes.
You're a rebel.
So to these jars, I've added a couple cloves of garlic, a couple fresh, somebody help me out. Thank you. Basil leaves. And I do want to say that the spices that I'm adding, they're flavor enhancers. So if there's something you're allergic to, don't use it. If there's something you don't like the flavor of, or your family doesn't, don't use it. These are all flavor enhancers. Also, my family, we love garlic. Like super love garlic. So I wrote the recipe very mild. All the recipes in here are mild. But once you make it and you go, hey, Sarah's not right. That wasn't garlicky enough or something. Just know that the recipes in there are written for a very mild palate, and then you can adjust those spices as needed. Now, does anybody know what happens to spices when we can them? What happened?
Do they dilute?
Do they dilute?
Yeah, they're not as strong.
That's close, but the other direction.
They intensify.
They intensify. Spices intensify, and we'll talk about this in pressure canning, but for right now, water bath canning, they also intensify because they do leach into the liquid inside the jar, and because they do sit, right? So you're canning something so it is shelf stable, so you can put it on your shelves and not need any refrigeration. So because they're gonna sit for a little bit longer, those spices really do leach into the water or the broth or the juice or whatever you're using, and can intensify it over time. All right, so to this I'm adding mustard seed, coriander seed, and some peppercorns, about half a teaspoon of each. Also, you could use fresh dill if you want. I'm gonna use some dill seed. Now, as far as it goes, using fresh or using dehydrated, it's totally up to you. Use what you have available to you. And you can also use pre-mixed spices. So basically what we're using here is what I would call a generic pickling spice. You can also buy these on your grocery shelves, but they're in those little tiny containers, and they're usually like $4 or $5 a piece. So price per pound or price per ounce, it is much cheaper to make your own in bulk, or like buy bulk pickling spices from Azure Standard or somewhere like that. Did you have your hand raised? No? Okay, sorry. So I make all my own pickling spices because it is just easier to make this in bulk and then throw it in a couple half-gallon jars and just dip into it all year round than it is for me to try to buy all of those spices in those little tiny containers. I will use one of those in one canning session. Any questions so far? Yeah?
Does the amount of fresh versus dry differ if you're using like fresh?
Yeah, so dry tends to be a little less intense. And so usually when I'm using dry, I will add just a touch more. And especially if I'm putting, like the fresh basil I put in here, I actually tore the leaves, which you don't have to. But anytime you tear the plant or tear the herb, or you crush it with a mortar and pestle, something like that, anytime you do that, that taste intensifies. So I can use less basil if I just tear it up a little bit and let it intensify. Great question. All right, did I get all the spices in there? Coriander seed, mustard.
I'm gonna butt in for a second. General rule of thumb when you're cooking is 1/3 of dried to however much the recipe calls for of fresh. So that's a good guide you can follow too, is you need 1/3 of dried because it's dried is a little more concentrated. So if your recipe calls for 3 tablespoons of, fresh garlic, you might only want to do 1 tablespoon of the dried and start from there and go up to see how you like it.
So if you've never pickled anything before in your life, I promise you when you go to make this recipe, you're going to say, oh my gosh, Sarah screwed up. This smells horrible. It does. It absolutely does. When I am pickling, my son, I tell the story, the cowboy candy or the jalapeno candy, he will always come upstairs and go, oh my gosh, Mom, it smells so bad out here. Just open a window, please. I'm dying. I can't breathe. It's just the pickling brine that is heating up, and it does smell horrible. I promise you it does not taste like it smells, and as soon as he finds out that I'm making jalapeno candy, he's like, oh, do you need any help? Can I help? What do you need me to do? So it does smell bad. I promise you, you have not made a mistake. It stinks.
So in that, you're heating up the vinegar and the sugar.
Yes, it's the vinegars, the sugar, a tablespoon of salt, and the water. And so the way I wrote the recipes, I tried to write them as beginner friendly as possible. So when you read the recipe, it will give you the ingredients that need to be heated on the stove, and then it will give you the ingredients per jar. So that allows you to decide if you want to double, triple, however many. Because if I've got 12 jars, all I need to know is I need half a teaspoon of peppercorns for each. Doesn't matter how many I'm using. So that's how I kind of laid out all the recipes so you can mass can them. Because who in here, there's not many people, but many people don't really can just 2 or 3 jars once or twice a year. Most of us can because we're trying to get food on the shelves. We're trying to make sure our harvest is preserved, so we've got some food security. So I wanted to write this in a way that you could line up all the jars if you wanted to.
That's good. Like you said, most people do mass. But
Yeah.
some people, you have a little bit left to do with the season.
That's right. That's right. She said it works well because if you've got a lot and you need to get a lot on the shelves, it works. But also if you just have a little bit at the end of the season that you want to use, it still works.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Cowboy candy.
I'm sorry?
About cowboy candy.
Cowboy candy?
How dependent is that on sugar? Could you substitute Splenda or would you lose the candy texture?
The pickling brine itself is the acid inducer for that.
But
So,
substituting Splenda, like I always thought cowboy candy had sort of a candy or a.
oh, you mean is it as sweet? Is that what you're asking?
Does it have the same candy texture?
Is the texture the same? Have you used Splenda in cowboy candy? Because I haven't. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that Splenda is cup for cup when it comes to sugar, and it is as sweet as sugar, and some people even find it slightly sweeter than sugar. But as far as the consistency, is it like an actual candy coating? I don't know. If you've ever had cowboy candy, it has like a syrupy coating to it, like a maple syrup, but it doesn't taste like maple syrup.
I've used the powdered baking Splenda, or stevia. Stevia. I'm allergic to anything Splenda or aspartame, so I can't speak to those because they make me violently ill. But I have used the baking stevia. Stevia is a plant, not a chemical, and so I do much better with that. I have used that. You just have to boil it a little longer to make it get to that maple syrup kind of consistency. Yeah.
And again, anytime you are looking at a recipe and you're like, my family can't have this or I can't have that, go with what you can have and do a small batch. If you were worried about pH, if you were worried about acidity, you can literally get the little strips online. You can go to Amazon or whatever, the pH testing strips. You can dip that strip down into your brine. It's going to give you a pH acid level. So you can do all that at home yourself.
I have a pH. I was just going to digital pH meter.
Oh, fancy! I want one of those. She's got a digital
I'm
one.
not standing there under my kitchen light going, okay, how purple is it?
Yeah.
You just give me a number. Okay.
The other thing with this is these don't need lemon juice. So some of your tomato products, they are right on the line of acidity. Like, do I need lemon juice? Don't I need? There's a couple topics that if you wanted to actually like start a canning war, this is one of them for sure.
If you want to get blocked, banned, and not allowed back into certain groups, just ask them about water bathing green beans and you'll start World War III.
Yeah, so in adding lemons to tomatoes, not adding lemons to tomatoes, I'm going to tell you this. Every single tomato is different. Your tomato from your backyard is going to be different than mine, even if they're the same seed, the same species of tomato, everything. Because what's in the soil goes into the food. And so the acid level on a food can change drastically from your tomatoes to my tomatoes, and we're right next door and we're right doing the same exact thing. All right? And so when you look at other canning books, it will say, you have to add lemon juice to do this. You don't have to add it for that. It changes all the time. All the time. So what you can do is you can get those pH testing strips, number one. Or number two, lemon is a wonderful addition to tomatoes and tomato products. It actually brightens and freshens the flavor of a tomato. And so you can add just a little tiny bit of tomato juice to every single jar, put your mind at ease, raise the acidity. If you want to start a war, ask somebody if they use lemon juice in their tomatoes. For sure.
Do you have to have it at a certain pH level? Are you supposed to be testing them all the time?
No, you don't have to test them all the time. I said you can test it if you want to like put your mind at ease.
Yeah.
So what you want is in your canning books, it will give you the exact recipe to follow.
Yeah. And just
Yeah,
do that. I feel
Just
like
do that. Yeah, you're totally fine. But some people do get very nervous, especially when they have first started canning, and they want that visual confirmation of, okay, my strip is in the green, and I know my food is good, and I did a good job, or I did the right thing. And that's okay too. I just like to try to give everybody as many options as possible so you can do what you're comfortable with.
And with tomatoes, there's so many different varieties of tomatoes, but there are tomatoes that have been bred for 100 years to slice and put on a sandwich. And they don't have the acidity of the tomatoes that have been bred for the last 100 years to be canned. Well, the people that are doing the testing can't say that you're using Romas versus Dr. Ricci's. They don't know what you're using in your home, so they have to do a blanket statement and tell you what works for the lowest acid slicer tomato or cherry tomato as opposed to what works for a canning tomato. And so that's also, they're trying to protect you. They have your best interests at heart, and so that's part of the reason. And I'm a why learner. I had to tell you why. I was an impulse. I'm sorry, Sarah.
Oh, no, you're fine. All right, so what we're going to do next is we're going to fill it up with that hot brine. And you can use a ladle to do this and ladle it in. We're going to fill to 1 inch headspace. I do want to tell you, I am going to just pour this in just because I'm an experienced canner. It's super quick for me this way, but you should ladle it in if you're brand new.
Can you explain the 1 inch headspace on
Absolutely.
a jar? Thank you.
Okay, so the headspace refers to, let me use an empty jar. The headspace refers to the space between the top level line of where your food comes and the top of the jar. That's the headspace. It's the air space, if you will. It's the space that's not filled with anything. And so a 1 inch headspace measures to that first ring. If you're old school, you can still do this. You turn the jar halfway. There's another ring in the middle, and there's another ring at the top, and that goes ½ inch, ¼ inch, etc. So that is the space right in here. That's chapter 4 in your book when we talk about exactly what the terminology for headspace. What I do want to say is when you are following canning recipe, that headspace is before you can it. So it's when you put the food in the jar. Right now we're going to put the food in the jar. It's a 1 inch headspace because look at what it looks like when you're done. That's more than 1 inch, correct? Yeah, it's underneath the lip of the jar. Does anybody know why that happened? No, I didn't get any siphoning. Yeah, the food it shrinks. It gets soft. It smushes down. In fact, when you make some recipes like the jalapeno candy that we're talking about, those will actually float to the very top. Oh, here. Sometimes they will float to the very top as things kind of separate. And then as they sit over time, they reabsorb that juice, they start to expand, and they start to fill the jar again. So that headspace sometimes can look less than what you started with, and that's because of the shrinkage of the food, okay? So that's perfectly normal. Also, it's perfectly normal for tomatoes to float. They are very high water food, so they will separate inside the jars. Any other questions about headspace or what to fill it up to? No? Okay, so yeah, you're welcome. The ladle I'm talking about is something like this. You would put the funnel on top of the jar. The funnel helps protect the lip of the jar so you don't get a bunch of food particles on the lip of the jar. You want that as clean as possible so you get a nice seal of your lid. All right? So I'm going to use a funnel and I'm just going to pour this because it's a lot quicker. I'm going to get 3 or 4 jars in there. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll finish up while Tammy starts walking you through dairy products. Not yet, Tammy. I'm almost done.
I was just checking the time.
How am I on time? Oh, okay. The other thing is the debubbling process. So if you have a food with a lot of little food bits and a lot of liquid, I use a wooden skewer. Some people use a debubbler. It's an actual like plastic piece that comes in your kits. I just use a wooden skewer because I'm cheap and I can get these at the dollar store for really cheap and I can recycle them. And you just are going to run this in the jar like so. Tap down a little bit, and what this does is it releases any air bubbles that may be in between the tomatoes, and then once you've released the air bubbles, you may need to adjust your headspace again because it's filled up with liquid and so you got a little more headspace. We're still sitting at about 1 inch here, so I'm going to call that jar good.
Is it okay to use a butter knife? Because sometimes I do.
Your kitchen year rolls. So, some people...
I'm like, I don't have that, so I just shove a butter knife in there.
These, you get a package of 100 at the Dollar Tree for $1.25 because it's not the Dollar Tree anymore. We call it the 5-quarter tree now. So if you have 5 quarters, you can get 100 of these, and then when I'm done, I break these and they go into either the compost or sometimes I use them in the garden as sticks for my seedlings, so I know what's in my garden. But anyways, okay, back to the butter knife. If you use metal inside of a jar, there is a train of thought, and it's somewhat true, that the metal can react with the liquid that is in the jar and create more bubbles. So that's why a lot of people say stay away from that. Use a rubber spatula, use something that is silicone, something that won't react with it and create more bubbles on you when you're trying to eliminate bubbles. The reason we don't want any bubbles in there, and you cannot get it perfect, you're just doing the best you can. Some people tap it down, some people use these. The reason we don't want bubbles is we want even heating all the way around the jar. Okay, once you have one jar done, like me, I'm just gonna show you, we're gonna put the lid on. Everything has been pre-washed, so we're nice and clean. These lids, the Superb lids, is anybody currently using these? Like them? Like them? Does anybody not like them? Okay. I've been using these for about 2 years. Tammy's been using them a little bit longer than I have. And we love these. So I know, John's like,
When that lid pops, it makes you feel so successful. Because it pops louder than any lid I've ever used.
yes, it does pop a lot louder. And the first time it popped inside my pressure canner. And I thought a jar broke because there's like a loud echo in a pressure canner. And I tripped over the dog because I thought, oh my God, my jar broke. And it was the lid. It's just that loud. It's a very thick metal. It's the only one that I use in my canning. We do about 2,000, 2,500 jars a year, depending on how many deer I take. And I'm just wiping the rims with vinegar, and I got a little sugar on that one. But they're thick. They're coated 5 times. You don't get that corrosion and rust that you get with some of the other brands. I don't know what else to say except it's just a more superior type of lid. Also, they're very readily available. Now we're getting them in our stores all over the place, and they're cheaper than a lot of the other lids. I do have some older lids that I sometimes use for like my dehydrated goods or like my herbs and things because I don't want to get rid of them, right? I pay for them, I want to use them. But as far as like trusting food to something, these are the only ones I trust my actual food to that we're going to be eating. All right, so once you wipe the rim, you center the lid and you put this on. This is the ring, finger light. I know, your grandma said finger tight. Probably for 100 years, we've been saying finger tight. Last year I said we're not using that word anymore. I'm embedding a new word. It's called finger light. Because the word tight to you means something different to you, means something different to you, right? We all have a different degree of tightness. So what I teach everybody is 3 fingers on the jar. You're gonna put the lid on. Normally this is on the countertop, but I'm gonna hold it up so you can see. I'm just going to turn this with those 3 fingers until the ring engages with the jar and the jar starts to spin. That's it. That's it. That's all you need. Now, our older lids, we used to have to crank them down. I've been canning a couple decades now. Tammy can tell you too. There was a reason we cranked those down. They had rubber in them. The lids were different. They were treated differently. We had to boil them. We had to preheat them. There was a whole different set of standards and rules that we had to use with those lids. We have newer lids. They're made of newer materials. They do not need that, and in fact, they don't function as well when we do that. They need to be loose enough that the lid does not prematurely seal and that it allows the air out of the jar. What causes our food to spoil? Air. 100% air. Sunlight also helps break it down, microbes, enzymes, all of those things, but actual air is the #1 killer of food. I don't. Tatler lids I do. If you use Tatler lids.
What takes place in the air? Because I sometimes got done it too tight and just full water goes in.
Full water goes in. So you can get siphoning where the water comes out, but for water to actually come in, that means that you didn't get any pressure in the jar to push that air out. So I would definitely suggest checking to make sure you have a full rolling boil happening and that they're fully boiling when you get them in there before you start your timer. Because the oxygen, the way this works is all sciencey stuff. The pressure inside the jar will push the oxygen out. The liquids in this jar, the air in this jar, everything is trying to escape. As the jar is heated on the inside, it's trying to escape. So your liquids and your oxygen should be going outwards. Now when you look at a jar and it's done, it's not that there's food all the way up to the top. But what we've created here is what we call an anaerobic environment or hermetic environment. It's an environment without oxygen. So even though you see space in there, there's no oxygen in there. Does that help? Okay. Tatler lids are reusable lids. They're very finicky. They're very hard to use.
Are these lids reusable or one and done?
Okay, I have two answers to that. I'm gonna get these in here while we talk about it. Tammy, do you possibly
They're both full.
Oh wait. That's okay. That's okay. You got an extra one? Perfect. That's the trivet, by the way. Come on, Titanic. See.
That's why the first, and that's why the first jar always goes in the center to hold the trivet down.
So we're talking about lids and reusing lids, and while we're doing that, I'm going to keep going jars. So any manufacturer is going to tell you that their lids are one-time use and they're done. Ball lids have a 18-month seal. I think Kerr has an 18-month seal. Superb has a 36-month seal, so a 3-year seal on theirs. And then the Tattlers and a couple other companies are what we call reusable. They're actually like plastic, TPA-free plastic lids.
I canned stuff 6 years ago. That's the first time I got my hands on these lids. I can tell you that I still have stuff I canned 6 years ago that is still sealed well with these lids.
Yeah, so when we give testimonies, it's just because we can so much food. So the lid manufacturers will tell you they are a one and done. And the reason they do that one and done is because when that canning lid leaves its factory, it has passed all of the inspections for that canning lid. Once you use that canning lid, they can no longer say, we don't know what you've done to it, so we're not sure if you can reuse it again, don't do it. So you're always going to hear from your manufacturers, don't. We talked about earlier canning wars. That is another canning war question. The third one is stacking jars, if you guys want to talk about that later. That's a fun one.
They really love it when I disprove all of the things that they say by quoting the agency that they should have looked at in the first place that says if you put cardboard between it, you can stack them 4 high. But they never come up with that answer before they get told that. I don't know why. They always say, oh no, you can't do that.
So, have I reused lids? Absolutely. I don't know if you remember, but like
You should always take those
2019,
off.
huh?
Yeah. But you stack them like that, that's okay.
2019, 2020, we had a lid shortage, like a huge lid shortage, not a small one. If you were canning during that time, we were scrambling. And what happened was Superb kind of came in and they're like, hey, we can help. Like, we have a factory, we have people, what do you need from us? And so it took like 400 Amish families that came together and said, let's figure this out. If you guys can make them, we can tell you what we need from them. And so during that time, a lot of us that were not reusing lids at the time even started reusing lids because we didn't have a choice at that point. I will say this, if you are bending any rules ever in canning, you better know what you're doing. And what I mean by that is, you gotta know what you're looking for. It's not just about knowing how to do something, but it's about knowing how not to do it. So with your reusing of canning lids, you wanna make sure there's no rust, no dents, that the silicone on the outside is nice and fluffy for you. You need to know what to look for and what not to look for. The other thing is it worth the price of your food? That's the other thing. You are gonna put hours of labor love into growing this food, pulling this food, or even if you don't grow it, you're gonna spend an hour canning it up. All to have that fail over a 3-cent lid. So I suggest if you do a lot of canning, get that baker's dozen. That's gonna get you through at least the first part of your canning season. You may only need to buy 2 of those a year. You've invested in the equipment, you've invested in food, you've invested in the time, invest in the lids. I mean, it makes no sense to cheap out right at that last second and lose all your food. So that's my opinion on reusing lids. I'm gonna keep going with this. If you guys don't have any questions on how to do this bruschetta, I'm gonna start the timer for 10 minutes once I get a full rolling boil, and then I'm gonna pass this to Tammy.
You said you freeze the tomatoes sometimes.
Yeah.
Do you have to thaw this completely before putting them in the jar since they're very?
Yeah, so what I do is if I have a frozen product but a hot brine, I will let those tomatoes thaw first. Otherwise, when I add the hot brine, everything just cools off real quick. But yeah, that's a great question. And you can actually stick them in your refrigerator overnight and just let them thaw in there overnight and then start your canning in the morning. In order to do this, you need 2 inches of water over the top of the jars. Water bath is completely submerged. So don't forget that part. Sure. Sure. You're talking about like expiration dates and things like that. So in our household, what we try to do is rotate everything in a 1 to 3 year rotation. It gives us the best quality of food and the best nutritional value. But here's the thing, if you processed it properly, if it is sealed, if it stays in the perfect environment, no sunlight, no rapid, it stays forever. It stays forever. So it's not like your tomatoes just all of a sudden in 20 years are like, oh, I'm not gonna be edible anymore. But what happens is they change over time. So who wants to eat 20-year-old tomatoes? So 1 to 3 years about. We do ours harvest to harvest. So come July, come August, I want my shelves almost empty. If there is 40 quarts of corn left on my shelf, I know I planted too much the year before, or I got too much the year before, and I need to adjust for the upcoming year. And so I am a type A, and so what I do is I keep a spreadsheet because I run my house like a business, and I track what did I grow, what did I buy, how much did we can, how much did we eat. And I do that quarterly. So every 3 months I go in there and I just log how many jars do we use of that, and then I adjust from year to year so I make sure that we have enough for us.
Maybe my last question. You're putting this in not a roaring boil. You're just submerging it and then turning it on to a roaring boil?
You can't start the timer until you have a roaring boil.
But you can put them in there when they're just...
That you can put them in there during a roaring boil because I've got a hot brine and I've got warm hot jars. Yep, so if it's already boiling really good for you, go ahead and put them in. As long as it stays at a rolling boil, you can go ahead and start your timer for 10 minutes.
But you can also put them in if it's not a roaring boil.
That's correct, and turn it up very, very high, wait for it to come to a rolling boil, and then start your timer. Great questions. Thank you guys. I'm going to turn this over to Tammy. She's going to talk to you about pressure canning and dairy products, and then we're just kind of flip-flop back and forth. Does everybody need a break? Are you guys good? I don't know. You want to give a break for 5 minutes or so?
I'm ready, but feel free to walk in and out.
So she's going to start, and I'm going to just keep canning.